Hello everybody and welcome to Digital Hammurabi. If you're new to the channel, my name is Megan Lewis. I'm an Assyriologist and the channel is run with my husband, Dr. Joshua Bowen, who is also an Assyriologist. He's not with us physically at the moment. He's going to be running production. But if you have questions that come out of today's topic, please do put them in the live chat and tag at Digital Hammurabi. Josh is going to collect them for us and then we'll ask Dr. Carr at the end of the show. Today I'm talking to Dr. Karen Carr, who is going to tell us about swimming in the ancient world, which I'm really excited about and seems very appropriate given the weather here, especially in southern Maryland, which is hot and humid, and swimming is one of the only reliefs that we have at the moment. So Dr. Carr, if you wouldn't mind just giving some background information about yourself, who you are, how you got into the field, and what you're working on right now.
I was a classics major, a classics and archaeology double major in college. I actually started Latin in middle school.
Wow.
I think I was about 11. And I had a genius teacher who really turned me on to Latin. So, that's kind of how I got into it. And then I went on to graduate school at Michigan and was fortunate enough to immediately get a tenured position.
Oh, that's fantastic.
At Portland State. And I stayed at Portland State in a history department. And the great thing about being in a history department is that they didn't care whether I concentrated on classics or whether I went in a more sort of global direction. And that freed me up to do things like this history of swimming that isn't just the ancient world, but to really look at things in a sort of more global perspective. Mm-hmm. And I stayed there for, I think, about 25 years, a little more than 20 years, and then resigned tenure to focus on my website, which is Quattrus Study Guides. And then just recently, I've sort of been moving more into writing. Mm-hmm. Publishing other things besides the website.
Fantastic. And if the viewers are interested, I have put a link to Quattrus in the description so you can take a look and see what Dr. Carr has been working on. I have to say, I think you're the first person I've ever met who resigned tenure to do something else.
I actually had a model. John Humphrey, who runs the Journal of Roman Archaeology, was one of the members of he was the senior member of my thesis committee, and he resigned tenure.
Oh, wow.
Small children. And for years afterwards, everywhere I went, people were like, you were, John Humphrey, and did you know he resigned tenure? And like, how did that happen? So I think it seemed more possible to me maybe than most people, because I had known someone who had done it for similar reasons, because he wanted to spend more time on the Journal of Roman Archaeology and not teaching.
Fantastic.
And I think I also had 3 small children. Mm-hmm. So, I ended up feeling that the website, working full time and having 3 small children was not
that's a lot to deal with. Yeah. We also have 3 small children, and that is it's a full-time job by itself.
Exactly. So resigning my position meant, for example, that I was able to walk my youngest to and from school every day. Mm-hmm. And
wonderful.
That would not have been possible otherwise.
Yeah.
So, I think it's all worked out pretty well.
And I have to say the website is very impressive. And going on a little bit of a tangent before we go into the topic of today's interview, do you feel that what you're doing on Quattrus reaches more people than... I've frozen. Am I back now? I'm back. Okay. Do you feel like what you're doing on Quattrus maybe reaches more people than you would staying in a tenured position?
Oh, absolutely. We reach something like 20,000 people a day.
Oh, gracious.
And over the whole course of my teaching career, I've only reached maybe that many, but fewer. Wow. So absolutely, it's a way to get the word out in a much larger way than just classes.
And it's encouraging for me as an early career person to see someone who had tenure actually choosing of their own volition to take an alternative route with their academic career, which is...
I think it's so important to say that, there are a lot of things you can do that aren't necessarily teaching classes. And, there's something to be said for a steady paycheck.
Yep.
But I think that the world would benefit from more people doing what you're doing and what I'm doing, and really trying to participate in a larger world and not just the undergraduates.
Yes, and I think I feel like it's becoming a more pressing need with the changing landscape of academia, in that there are fewer and fewer full-time paid positions for for the classics and for Assyriology anyway. So we're turning out graduate students and professional people who need work, but there aren't those tenure track positions in existence as much as there was maybe 20, 30 years ago.
No, that's certainly true. I mean, not that there was a whole lot of them years ago, but it's much worse than it was. And certainly before people fall into being lifelong adjuncts, they should take a minute and look around them and say, I'm a good writer, I'm a good presenter, teacher. How can I turn that into something on my own, into a business or into a way to serve the community that isn't necessarily teaching classes for $3,000 a pop.
Yes, which is, for those who have not done any kind of teaching, that is not a lot of money for an awful lot of work. Adjuncting is not something that I think I would be happy doing unless there was no alternative. So having said that, thank you for that introduction. So you're writing a book on the history of swimming.
I am.
That's fantastic. How did you get into that, looking at that as a topic of study?
Absolutely through the website that I was, I was in the habit for a long time that I would sort of get up in the morning, get the kids settled, sit down, and kind of flip around the website until I came to something that we hadn't written about yet, and then I would write about it. And that was sort of my normal process. And then, so one day in the summer, I thought, I'll write about the history of swimming. And I started my sort of normal process of looking up what books existed on the history of swimming and what people had to say. And there's nothing. I mean, I was like, oh my God, this is really written about. There were books about it that were 100 years old, and there were a couple of sort of very popular, not very popular, very popularizing, very shallow, so to speak, things about how much people love the water or something, but children's version of a history of swimming. But there was nothing serious. There was nothing academic. And then I thought, well, this is actually it's a pretty interesting subject. I mean, one of the things that I saw right away, or that I saw pretty quickly, I think in the course of that same day, was that that it's something that changes over time, that it's not like everybody has always pretty much been the same kind of swimmer that they are now. There's definitely a lot of changing. And anytime as a historian, when you see that you've come upon something that has changed over time, that's kind of, for me, that's kind of what you're looking for. You're going to say, why has that changed? What caused that to happen?
And are there, within that diachronic development, are there also geographical factors at play? Do you see different trends in different places?
So what I would say is sort of I think of it as the swimming hole, but I mean, I realize that's kind of a joke. The hole in swimming, I think, happens where pretty much everybody knows how to swim. Pretty much everyone around the world is probably a pretty good swimmer until the last ice age. And then for the first time, you have people who stay up north during the ice age instead of retreating to where it's warmer. And they start to build houses and wear leather clothing. And there are a lot of sort of cultural changes. And I think one of them is that they forget how to swim. I looked it up, and the temperature, sort of averagey summer temperatures in that ice age zone, stay in the 60s Fahrenheit, so under 20 Celsius.
So pretty chilly still.
So pretty chilly. I mean, rather like Britain in the summer. And I think it's just not that tempting for people to get in the water. They don't want to. They don't see any need to. And there's not a lot of big bodies of water in Central Asia and Northern Europe anyway. And so the water's too cold and they just don't swim. Then when the Ice Age is over, it's less obvious why they don't swim because it's become warm again, but they've established this kind of non-swimming.
It's a cultural norm by then.
Right. And I think that's kind of the root of it, that you can trace all of the non-swimming to this one group of people who were up north during the last Ice Age.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So moving slightly to the article that you sent me earlier, and again that's also linked in the description for anyone who's interested. You wrote about kind of the racial implications of swimming, and especially swimming in the classical Greek and Roman periods. Do you want to talk a little bit about that for people who haven't managed to read the article?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I'd love to,
because I read it and I was like, oh wow, that's really, really interesting.
So I when you look at Greek and Roman swimming, what it looks like is that, like other people who were sort of Northerners, Europeans, and pretty much everyone in West Asia also, and we don't think of the Middle East as being cold, but the people who live there are descended from these cold people. Pretty much the Greeks and Romans in the Bronze Age don't seem to have known how to swim. And then they seem to have learned. They came in contact with other people in the Mediterranean, with Egyptians, with Carthaginians, and those people knew how to swim. And so the Greeks and Romans learned, but they learned as a sort of accomplishment, like reading, like writing, like
it was like a status marker.
Advanced studies of various kinds. They thought of it as an accomplishment rather than as a sort of natural thing that everybody knew how to do, like walking. So as it says in the article, they made a contrast in their minds between speaking and walking, which were natural to everybody, and reading and swimming, which you had to be taught in lessons. And we still do that. We still assume that swimming is something that are taught in lessons, and reading also. So they came to associate it with kind of the upper classes, educated people who had opportunities and privilege. That was who knew how to swim. And we've absorbed that into our own culture, so that we also tend to think of swimming as something that is an accomplishment and a mark of being upper class and privileged, and not something that just everybody naturally does.
Interesting, thank you. So is there, you said there was a contrast between the Greeks and the Romans, and then the Egyptian culture, lifestyle when it comes to swimming and being around the water. Can you speak maybe a little bit about the Egyptian experience with swimming?
Right, so the Egyptians, very, very different. As far back as we can see, the Egyptians are like super enthusiastic swimmers. I mean, they live on the Nile, right? So they're in and out of the water all the time. They use the Nile as their main source of transport. So they're constantly sort of by the side of the Nile. Water is going to play an enormous part in their lives. And then it's warm enough almost all year round to swim, right? Pretty much all the time. It's nice enough to swim. And it's hot enough so you really,
you want to, yeah.
Right. And so despite the various dangers of catching diseases in the water and so forth, crocodiles and whatnot, in fact, they seem to have been in the water all the time. The earliest evidence is from hieroglyphs, which appear around like 3000 BC. People start writing in hieroglyphs. And one of the hieroglyphs that exists that far back is a swimmer. Right, it shows a guy, like this, clearly swimming, and it makes the sound of the Egyptian word for swim, which I don't know offhand.
Yeah.
But it's clearly a swimmer. There's no corresponding event in Greece or Rome. So, you can kind of see that even at the beginning of the Bronze Age, they're swimming.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are many, many other images of Egyptians swimming down to the bottom of the river to pick up the fishing net, Egyptian girls sort of swimming attractively through the pond.
With lilies floating.
Lilies, and so, yes, exactly. There are a whole series of spoons where the handle is a swimming girl with her hands outstretched like this, holding on. And just, there are probably thousands of images of people swimming from ancient Egypt.
Fantastic. And I know it's a little bit later. There are the Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs have military reliefs showing Assyrian soldiers kind of swimming across a body of water, kind of using, it looks like, I think they're inflated leather skins as flotation devices.
It's floaties to swim.
Yeah, which I love.
I've said that in lectures and had people push back and say, "Oh, it's something about they're using them as to breathe from. They're not using them as floaties."
Mm-hmm.
I can't say I'm really convinced. I think over the years, people have really come up with a lot of explanations to try to, just in disbelief that the Assyrians would
use floaties.
But I mean, and I guess it might be possible to swim underwater, inhaling, but you also see people sitting on them in other images.
Yeah, and you'd think they'd be so buoyant that like pushing them down under the water to use them as breathing would be tricky.
Things is that they
float.
They float, yeah. So it's hard to imagine how you would be swimming underwater and concealing yourself underwater as a result of having a floating thing.
Quite.
But just so you know, people do push back on that.
Yes.
But it's striking even earlier than that, to go back to the Bronze Age, that there's not a single image on a cylinder seal of anyone swimming.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So to correspond with the Egyptian hieroglyph from the Bronze Age, you might expect to see on cylinder seals that there would be
something similar. Yeah.
Something similar, that we have many, many different scenes, people drinking beer, people picking fruit, we have a lot of different things on cylinder seals, scenes from daily life, and none of them have anybody in the water.
Do you think would you see that as evidence that swimming was either not happening or that it was just not as important culturally speaking, so they saw no need to record it?
I think it's really not happening. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are probably exceptions. There are probably people who do teach themselves to swim. To a certain extent, I think nobody has ever succeeded in keeping small boys from paddling ponds when nobody's looking. But I don't think it's a swimming culture. I don't think swimming is something that they think of as a normal activity that people do, except in the sense of sort of small beggar boys or something like that.
And then when this kind of is maybe additional information to feed into that, you have in the Old Babylonian period, in the Bronze Age, like the river Ordeal, where kind of like the witch trials that happened in the UK. You throw someone in a river, and if they live, then they're innocent.
If they live, then they're innocent, and if they think, then they're guilty, right? But take this example from Thailand, from medieval Thailand. In medieval Thailand, they have a similar thing that they do to accused criminals, to people who have a lawsuit brought against them. And what they do is the person bringing the lawsuit and the accused person go in the water, and they go underwater, and the first one to come up is the guilty one, is the one who's telling the.
So that's like the reverse,
right? So it's totally.
It's assuming that you can swim and you will come up again. And
there's a similar one from West Africa where they have to both swim across the river, and the first one to get there is the one that's telling the truth. Right.
That's absolutely fascinating.
That this is the involving rivers in telling whether people are telling the truth is kind of a global phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
But the take on it that the Middle Eastern law codes have is the take of people who can't swim,
Mm-hmm.
and not the take of people who can swim, who do it differently.
Yeah. Fantastic. So I know very little about African history, about East Asian history. Do you have time? Would you mind speaking a little bit about swimming in those very large geographical regions?
No, I mean, I don't mind, but I'm going to be more general because
absolutely fine.
Thing, and I obviously know it less well. Also, my own background is really in the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
But I have been working on it for the book, and the book, it will really cover the whole globe. What we see in, say, a place like Senegal in the 1400s, when well, let me back up. We actually know that people in Africa could swim from Pliny.
Mm-hmm.
That Pliny talks about how East Africans swim out to, what is it they do? They hunt tortoises, he says, and they capture the tortoises and make boats out of their shells. They're like giant tortoises.
Wow.
And he also says that they swim to hunt crocodiles. And we see that actually illustrated in like Nilotic mosaics from Roman houses.
Mm-hmm.
There's this popular scene of the pygmies hunting crocodiles. Although the Romans characteristically don't really show them swimming to do it. But clearly this is a story which is kind of known in Rome, that they thought that the Africans could swim better than they could.
Right.
But then when we get to like the 1400s and Portuguese ships start sailing around the coast of Africa, they remark over and over again, everywhere they go, they're like, oh my God, like we anchored the ship offshore because they can't come all the way to the beach with their big ships. And we were preparing to lower the dinghy, and then all of a sudden the ship is surrounded by
there are people everywhere,
right, who have just swum out to kind of see what's going on. And they're like, they say that they swim for a mile, 2 miles without really thinking about it. They just want to get somewhere the same way that you would walk a mile. Mm-hmm. They swim a mile. They don't think of it as a big deal. And then they're all kind of floating and treading water around the ship and waiting to see what will happen. And the Europeans are like, this is incredible. It's really weird. And you see it over and over in Senegal and in Mozambique. In Mozambique, Vasco da Gama he's captured a pilot, and he's trying to get the pilot to show him where to go next, because he's trying to reach India, and he's captured this Mozambican pilot. The pilot eventually decides he's had enough, and he just dives off the side of and swims away. And this is clearly not something that Vasco da Gama had sort of anticipated, that anyone could do that.
That's amazing.
So what ends up happening is that the Europeans explain this. They're like, why is it that everybody else in the world seems to be able to swim? Same thing happens in the Americas. Christopher Columbus reaches the Caribbean. Captain Cook reaches Hawaii. In the same way, people are swimming out to them in what seems to them to be incredible. Little children can swim. Everybody can swim. And what they end up saying is kind of the root of this racism that I was talking about in the article, that they start with the position that, or it's one root of it. They're like, why is it that all these people can swim and we can't swim at all? And they start to say, well, it's because they're animals. It's because they're like animals, right? Dogs can swim, horses can swim. That's why Black people can swim and
right.
brown people can swim.
It's definitely not because they're better at white people than anything at all.
Right, they can't be better at
yeah.
something. So it must be that they are just sort of natural swimmers. And then even today, what we end up with in the 19th century, the 20th century, is this distinction between natural swimming, which just makes you like an animal, and being taught to swim with lessons makes you an accomplished Greek and Roman sort of person. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of, we disapprove of natural swimming, and we end up forcing all of those people out of the water and preventing them from swimming. while at the same time we promote this kind of swimming for health, very formal, race-oriented swimming.
And we live right on the Chesapeake Bay, so we're very close to the beach. We have water all around us, and I'm really quite paranoid about my children going in the water, and I'm not comfortable with them like going out by themselves until they've had lessons for swimming, specifically to make sure that they know how to swim and they can be safe when they go out there.
Not unreasonably. It's, my pediatrician kept emphasizing, right, at the age that your children are, that the single biggest risk is drowning. That the thing that kills American 5-year-olds more than anything else is drowning, but it kills Black children at 5 times the rate of white children.
Oh, gracious.
Because they're much less likely to be taught to swim. And I suppose also because, their parents are less likely to be able to watch them every minute and so forth. They have less good daycares and so forth. But it's partly because they're not taught how to swim. They don't have the access to swimming lessons and so forth.
And I suppose in a culture and a society that kind of prioritizes swimming lessons as really the only way to interact correctly with the water, that ends up being a massive gatekeeping issue.
Right, exactly.
That's fascinating.
South, not so much maybe in Maryland, but any place further south than that, what you find is that public swimming pools all over the South closed rather than integrate.
Really?
Yes. In the mid-1960s, when it became clear they were going to have to integrate, they pretty much closed most of the public pools.
Wow.
And so now white people swim in private pools, so it's very expensive. No, it's moderately expensive, but it's too expensive, and they're located in the suburbs that white people move to rather than integrate the schools. So Black people typically have very limited access to the few remaining public pools.
I had absolutely no idea. And I also had no idea. I'm not terribly surprised, but I had no idea that was kind of rooted in the Greek and Roman classical background of modern European society and culture.
So that's why I feel that, classicists kind of have a responsibility to face up to that and not to say, oh, it was a long time ago. And so, it's all kind of, we can just sort of be proud of our connection to culture, but to sort of look at how is that being deployed today to have effects like all these children drowning. And how can we make sure that people are aware of that so they don't just unconsciously perpetuate that problem. Yeah, no,
exactly. I think that historians and classicists and people who try and do the public outreach work that we do, I think we definitely have a responsibility to try and dispel modern myths and show people where they came from and why they're not correct and why they should be examined a bit more.
Right, exactly.
So we will probably talk for a couple more minutes and then we will start taking some questions. So everyone, if you have questions for Dr. Carr, please do put them in the side chat. Tag Josh at Digital Hammurabi and he will save them. And then in about 5 minutes time, he will come in and join us and we will open up the conversation for those who wish to ask their questions.
So I just have one story then that I want
to Please do.
To kind of pull this together, I want to point out that there's virtually no mention of swimming in the Bible. And there's a little tiny bit in Ezekiel where it's sort of a parable, a metaphor, where he's talking about how if the river is too deep to stand in out of your depth, then there's no way to cross it. So,
yeah.
Yeah, all right. But then the only other place in the Old Testament, I think also in the New Testament, where you see swimming is the Jews crossing the Red Sea. Right? So Moses is leading the Jews to the Red Sea. But when you think of that in light of what we've just been saying over this conversation, you realize that the Jews are from the Middle East. They probably can't swim. Right? Culturally, they don't swim. So they arrive at the edge of the water with the Egyptians behind them.
Who definitely do swim.
Right. So the people hearing this story being told in Babylon or in Jerusalem or whatever, who are hearing this story for the first time, they're really much more tense than we are hearing that story, because to them, they're hearing a story about people they know can't swim being pursued to the edge of the water by people they know can swim. And then there's this enormous, very unexpected reversal in the story where the Jews make it across and the Egyptians drown.
Yeah.
And recently, Jody Magnus has been excavating these mosaic floors of synagogues in Israel. And it shows the Egyptian soldiers being swallowed up by these enormous fish, and it's kind of this kind of reinforces, how exciting this story was.
If you think about it and you take that information into account, it really does add an extra dimension that I had never thought of, and probably would never have occurred to me, because of course you can swim. Everyone swims.
Right. And people say that to me. I just had it on Twitter this morning, people writing in and going, well, I mean, maybe in America people can't swim, but in Australia everybody knows how to swim. And in the Netherlands everybody knows how to swim. And in Britain everybody knows how to swim. None of that is true. It's not at all true.
Oh, gracious. That's very interesting. Thank you. This is, and I you might not know, do you know of any textual references to swimming from like Mesopotamia? Because I've been thinking of it all morning and I haven't. There are boats everywhere.
Yeah. The Zoroastrian Avestas have not a reference to swimming, but verses about how you shouldn't defile the water with your body.
Oh, really?
They're particularly concerned about people not peeing in the pool.
Okay.
Which has remained a big concern for us and kind of an irrational concern.
Yeah.
There are always newspaper articles, why are people so irrationally concerned with people swimming in the pool? But it's in the Zoroastrian Avestas. It's in Hesiod's Works and Days. He says not to pee in the pool.
Really?
Not to pee in the river.
Yeah.
But obviously, it's not a big concern if people pee in the river, but it goes back to the Bronze Age. And but that is really pretty much it for any reference to any person's body being in the water from Mesopotamia. Because
I know the one thing, I was talking to Josh about it, and the one thing we managed to come up with was Gilgamesh bathing in the water after he he does swim, because he goes down to the bottom of the water to get the plant of life.
He's like dying. I mean,
and he's I don't think he counts, because he's this heroic mythological, semi-mythological figure, and everything he does is outside of the realm of the ordinary. So I feel like him actually voluntarily getting in the water and diving down is possibly just another illustration of how he is not normal and not ordinary.
By comparison, Odysseus swims in the Odyssey.
Yes.
He's shipwrecked. He swims to Nausicaa, to the land of the Phaeacians. But again, he's alone. Nobody else can swim. Only Odysseus. Just
him. Does everyone else drown?
Yeah, they drown.
Yeah. Lovely.
Even then, Odysseus has help from a magic veil that helps him, and he's within sight of shore. But he still needs the help of the magic.
Yeah. Wonderful. Josh, sweetheart, if you have some questions, if you would like to join us, that would be lovely.
All right.
Hello.
I do have some questions. Hey. Okay. Let's see. So Nick J asks, what are the methods used to determine how that before the Bronze Age a group of people did not swim, if I understood the conversation correctly?
Absolutely, right. We don't have writing, we don't have pictures, we don't have any way really of knowing. Archaeology can't really tell us much about We can't dig up ancient swimming pools and see whether people were swimming in them, and they didn't have swimming pools anyway. So you can't tell from a river whether people were swimming in it. But what we can say is that all of the people who lived in that area during the Ice Age, later descendants of those people can't swim. So the event that they all have in common, all of those people, is the Ice Age.
And do you see the reverse? Do you see the people who were in the southern areas during the Ice Age, do you see their descendants, generally speaking, do swim?
Yes. I'm still kind of struggling with the case of India, but India is a place where there's a lot of migration back and forth. So it's kind of a more muddled picture, which is what you would expect. But yeah, in Thailand, in the Americas, in Egypt and Africa, all of the places that were not affected by the Ice Age, in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, everybody can swim. So the one event that I can see, I mean, it's only sort of a theory, but the one event I can see that affects these people and not those people is the Ice Age.
Interesting.
All right. So Lieutenant Calloway asks, what is the earliest evidence of some artificial pool designed for recreational swimming? Was it the Johnson administration? He didn't put that last part. I did.
That was you.
I think Egyptians, well, there are Egyptians, and there are pictures of artificial pools. I don't think there are pictures of people swimming in the artificial pools. So we don't know for sure whether people swam in artificial pools in the Bronze Age Egypt, but they certainly built artificial pools. We know for sure that there are artificial pools in ancient Rome. In the Roman baths, there are natatoria, which are built on purpose for people to swim in, even though typically for the Romans sort of only kind of being able to swim, they run about 4 feet deep. So they're very convenient for people who aren't very big swimmers.
You can do kind of the swimming that my daughter does, where you kind of push with your arms, but you've got 1 foot very firmly on the floor.
Yeah, they seem to have done a lot of that. Or maybe sort of standing with your elbows on the
yes.
bed, talking to each other. But they do build giant natatoria, and they call them natatoria, like you were going to swim in them.
All right. So Mark asks, is it true that the Romans had a fear of the sea? And if so, did it ever change over time?
A fear of the sea. I can't think of any specific discussions of it. They certainly spend a lot of time in boats, and people probably say that because the Romans before the Punic Wars are not sailors, right? They have to capture a ship from the Carthaginians in order to learn how to build ships and go on the ocean. So that changes. That's a big change during the First Punic War, that they build a navy, and after that they have a navy. But they certainly do plenty of shipping all around the Mediterranean during the time of the Roman Empire. I wouldn't say they were afraid of the ocean in the sense that they were afraid to venture on it in a ship, but we don't see them swimming in the ocean.
Yeah, he might have been confusing the Romans with me. So I really have no sense of humor whatsoever. That's what I've learned just now. Okay. And the last question that we have is also from Mark. He says, in your opinion, did a person's attitude towards swimming influence how much of a maritime people they became? That is, the Phoenicians to the British Empire?
All of those people are pretty much non-swimmers. The Phoenicians, although there's a very interesting book out just recently. I'm blanking on the title, but it's like, who were the Phoenicians? Arguing that there is no such people as the Phoenicians, really. That's what the Greeks. It's a Greek term for a group of people who don't seem to have an identity themselves as a group. But let's say the Phoenicians and the Venetians and the British are all, what they have in common is that they don't swim. and the Greeks, who also sail a good deal, also not really great swimmers, probably. For instance, all the images we have of ancient Greeks and Romans swimming seem to show them holding their heads up out of the water, which we don't think of that as someone who's a really fantastic swimmer if they have to keep their face out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people become great naval powers. They use ships a lot because they live by the ocean. The Phoenicians, the Venetians, and the British, what they have in common is that they're surrounded by ocean, that they live right near the ocean. So, but I don't think it has much to do with whether they can swim. Mm-hmm. Famously, most of the soldiers and most of the sailors in the British Navy couldn't swim in the 19th century. That wasn't considered. It was considered almost a disadvantage because they wanted you to sort of stay with the ship and
not wander off.
We had 2 more questions come in, if you want, and then we'll.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. So Vibrantly Brandley asks, how historical are Mer people, and where should we look for them?
I'm not coming up with examples of Mer people from before the Middle Ages. They seem to emerge with other fantastic creatures in sort of medieval manuscripts. There are a lot of examples of Mer people in medieval manuscripts, but before that, I'm really not coming up with examples. So I think it's probably a medieval phenomenon, medieval European.
And I think probably today we can look for them in South Jersey. So Dr. Misha Griffith asks our final question. Again, there was my no sense of humor coming out again. Can we make any ritual connections between the ancients' feelings about swimming and the biblical ritual of baptism?
Oh, now that's an excellent question. It's not something I've given a lot of thought to, but I will. I do think that probably baptism comes from earlier Middle Eastern traditions, and I think it's probably related to the injunctions against, defiling the water and making the water dirty and stuff. This idea that the water is clean and pure, and it can make you clean and pure. Probably they are related, but I haven't really looked into it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josh, for keeping track of those questions. And thank you, Dr. Carr, for answering them for us. Before we go, is there anything you'd like to add? Any last thoughts, suggestions?
I wish I was funnier.
You were absolutely fascinating. So funny can wait for another time.
And we do have a super chat that just came in.
Oh, we do? Oh, lovely. Go for it.
Oh, yes. I will read it. Okay.
I can read it if you need
That's okay. So Dr. Carr, I apologize for this. We read these in a particular voice of a guy named Kent Hovind. So I apologize for how strange this is going to sound coming out of nowhere. Amateur textual criticism for £5. Okay. Quote.
Sorry, that's euros, honey.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for correcting
me
live, making
on
me feel dumb. All right. So I'm so focused on the content, that I just noticed it wasn't $1. So I can't back out of this. I messed up. Okay. Quote, they will spread out their hands in it as a swimmer spreads out his hands to swim. Isaiah 25:11a in the NIV, confer Peter in John 21:7. Thank you, amateur textual criticism.
There we go.
I don't know.
No, that's fine.
Well done.
So before we go, everybody, if you would like to check out Dr. Carr's website, it is in the description. The web address is https with the semicolon and the dash thingies, quatr.us. And then the Patreon page is patreon.com/QUATR_US. So take a look at both of those things. She's doing fantastic work to try and make history accessible to people who have decided to take a more sensible path in life and not get a history degree. And I'm sure she would appreciate some interested eyes on her material. So thank you from me, Dr. Carr, for joining us. This was really, really interesting, and has certainly given me a lot to think about. And from the questions we've had, I think the audience has probably enjoyed themselves greatly.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Of course. An audience, thank you all for joining us. As always, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?